She looked at the detective sitting across from her and said something that would change how everyone understood what murder really means. "He murdered who I was." Those were her exact words. Not "he tried to kill me," not "he abused me." She said he murdered who she was, a woman sitting alive in a police station describing the murder of herself. It started when she took a promotion at work, a job she'd dreamed about, a career that was supposed to be hers. But her husband couldn't understand why she would want anything more than him, so he started to remake her, to reshape her, to slowly erase the woman she was and replace her with someone who existed only in his imagination. He watched her so closely that he could predict every move she made. He controlled every choice she had. He loved her so much that he tried to destroy her. And when she finally started to escape, when she finally started to remember who she actually was, his response was to confess to murdering the woman he'd been killing all along. The only problem? She wasn't dead. She was sitting right there, alive, explaining to police how someone can murder you without ever laying a hand on you. This is the story of a marriage that became a slow murder. Of a man who loved a woman so much that he killed her identity, destroyed her sense of self, and then confessed to a crime that never happened because in his mind, he'd already committed it 1,000 times. And the woman who survived it. The woman who had to convince police that she was actually alive. To understand how a marriage becomes a slow murder, you have to go back to the beginning. To the moment when love became obsession, and obsession became violence. His name was Michael Chen. If you'd met him before 2017, you would have described him as unremarkable. He was 32 years old, worked in software development at a mid-sized tech company in Portland, Oregon, and lived alone in a one-bedroom apartment that he kept meticulously organized. He had coworkers he was friendly with but no close friends. He had family he called on holidays but saw rarely. He was, by every measure, a man who existed on the periphery of other people's lives, present but never central, known but never truly familiar. Michael had never had a serious relationship, not because he wasn't capable of one, and not because women didn't find him attractive. He was conventionally handsome in an understated way, quiet in a way that some people find compelling. He had simply never met a woman who matched the exacting specifications of the woman he'd been imagining since he was 16 years old. That woman had a name in his mind. It was Sarah. The imaginary Sarah was tall and graceful, with long dark hair and an intelligence in her eyes that suggested she understood things about the world that other people missed. The imaginary Sarah was kind, but not soft, strong but not aggressive, independent but ultimately devoted to him. The imaginary Sarah laughed at his jokes and remembered the small details about his life that mattered. The imaginary Sarah would look at him across a crowded room and know, with absolute certainty, that she belonged with him and only him. Michael had built this woman from fragments, a smile from a barista he'd seen once, the intelligence in the eyes of a woman on the subway, the laugh of someone he'd overheard at a coffee shop. He'd assembled her from pieces of real women into something that existed only in his mind, a woman so perfect that no real woman could possibly compete. For 16 years, the imaginary Sarah was enough. She kept him company in the quiet moments. She validated him during the difficult ones. She was always there, always agreeable, always exactly what he needed her to be. She was perfect because she had no agency, no contradictions, no inconvenient desires of her own. And then, in the spring of 2017, something shifted. Michael met a real woman. Her name was actually Sarah. She worked in the marketing department at his company. She was tall and graceful, with long dark hair. She was intelligent. She laughed easily. She was kind. She was, in many measurable ways, the embodiment of the imaginary Sarah he'd been carrying in his mind for so long that he'd almost believed she was real. His coworkers later described Michael as being different after he met her. Less withdrawn, more engaged. He started coming to after-work gatherings. He seemed lighter, as though a weight he'd been carrying had finally been lifted. What they didn't understand was that the weight hadn't been lifted. It had simply transferred itself from the imaginary woman in his mind to the real woman standing in front of him. Michael became obsessed with Sarah in a way that went far beyond normal attraction. He learned her schedule so well that he could predict exactly when she'd arrive at the office each morning. He began taking breaks at the same time she took breaks, walking past her cubicle frequently, always having an excuse to interact with her. He noticed everything about her, the way she held her coffee mug, the clothes she wore on different days of the week, whether she seemed happy or upset. He started keeping a notebook where he wrote down details about her, conversations she'd had with coworkers that he'd overheard, the way she'd phrased something in an email, the fact that she always brought lunch from home on Tuesdays but got coffee from the cafe on Thursdays. Sarah, for her part, was initially flattered by Michael's attention. He was thoughtful. He remembered things she'd mentioned in passing. He seemed to see her in a way that most people didn't. Within 3 months, they were dating. Within 6 months, they were moving in together. Within a year, Michael asked her to marry him, and Sarah, who had fallen in love with the man who seemed to understand her so completely, said yes. What Sarah didn't know was that the man she was marrying wasn't falling in love with her. He was merging her with the imaginary woman he'd been in love with for 16 years. To Michael, the real Sarah was becoming increasingly irrelevant. What mattered was whether she matched the specifications of the Sarah in his mind. And real Sarah, being a real person with her own agency, her own contradictions, her own inconvenient desires, started to fail those specifications almost immediately. The first major divergence happened about 3 months into their marriage. Sarah wanted to take a promotion that would require her to travel frequently for work. It was an opportunity she'd been dreaming about, a chance to work on major client accounts, to be recognized for her talents, to build her own career independent of anyone else. Michael couldn't understand it. In his mind, the imaginary Sarah would never want anything more than to be with him. The imaginary Sarah would see a career opportunity and think, but what about Michael? What about our life together? The real Sarah, however, was thrilled. She took the promotion. She started traveling 3 weeks out of every month. Michael experienced this as a betrayal. Not consciously, perhaps, but deep in his psyche, real Sarah was deviating from the script he'd written. She was asserting herself as a separate person with separate desires, and that separateness was, to him, a form of abandonment. He began to withdraw emotionally. He would greet her coldly when she returned from trips. He would make comments about her career being more important to her than he was. He would spend hours alone in their apartment, sitting in the dark, thinking about the ways real Sarah was failing to be imaginary Sarah. And slowly, over the course of months, Michael began to do something that would reshape the entire trajectory of his life and hers. He began to rewrite real Sarah into the imaginary woman she should be. It started small. When Sarah came home excited about a successful client meeting, Michael would listen politely, but then ask her why she hadn't called him while she was away, why she hadn't thought of him more, why she seemed to care more about work than about him. When Sarah spent time with her friends, women she'd known since childhood, Michael would become distant, implying that her loyalty should be to him first. When Sarah suggested they do things independently, go to different events, maintain separate social lives, Michael would interpret this as rejection. Real Sarah tried to adapt. She began calling him more frequently while traveling. She started turning down social invitations to spend more time with him. She made her career decisions in consultation with him, asking his permission before taking on certain projects. She slowly began to arrange her entire life around the architecture of Michael's imaginary woman. But no matter how much she changed, she could never quite become the Sarah in Michael's mind, because that Sarah didn't exist. That Sarah was a perfect phantom, and the more real Sarah tried to merge with her, the more frustrated Michael became with her inability to be a perfect ghost. Their marriage became increasingly strained. Sarah, who had initially felt seen and understood by Michael, began to feel suffocated. She began to sense that Michael didn't actually love her. He loved some version of her that existed only in his imagination, and every time she deviated from that version, he punished her with withdrawal, coldness, subtle accusations. By year 3 of their marriage, Sarah was deeply unhappy. She felt trapped. Michael was no longer her boyfriend or her husband. He had become a surveillance system, a judge, an arbiter of whether she was being the right version of herself. She began to see a therapist without telling Michael. She began to confide in her friends, slowly rebuilding the social life she'd sacrificed. She began to reclaim pieces of herself that Michael had convinced her to give up. And Michael, watching all of this, began to feel the imaginary Sarah dying inside real Sarah. He could see her slipping away, see her becoming less perfect, less devoted, less his. And instead of recognizing that what he was experiencing was the natural result of loving a phantom rather than a person, Michael began to do something far darker. He began to create a second Sarah. This happened gradually, and it happened inside his own mind. The original Sarah, the imaginary perfect woman he'd been in love with since he was 16, began to take on a new characteristic. She became a victim. She became a woman who was trapped in a marriage with a man she no longer loved, a woman who was trying to leave but didn't know how, a woman who needed to be rescued. Michael started to write stories about this Sarah. He would sit for hours at his computer while real Sarah was at work or traveling, and he would write elaborate narratives. In these stories, imaginary Sarah would be unhappy in her marriage. She would be trying to leave. She would be planning her escape, but she was afraid. She was trapped. She needed help. And in these stories, Michael was not the man holding her back. He was the man who would save her, the man who would finally set her free. The stories became increasingly elaborate. Michael gave them detailed plots. He wrote dialogue. He wrote descriptions of imaginary Sarah's emotional state, her reasons for wanting to leave, the obstacles preventing her departure. He created an entire mythology around her suffering and his eventual role in ending that suffering. What Michael didn't understand, what he couldn't understand because his psychological architecture didn't allow for it, was that he was no longer writing about imaginary Sarah at all. He was writing about the murder of real Sarah. In these narratives, the only way for imaginary Sarah to be free was for her to cease to exist. The only way to end her suffering was to end her. And in the twisted logic of Michael's mind, this became not an act of violence but an act of mercy. He was going to save her by killing her. He was going to free the imaginary woman trapped inside real Sarah by murdering real Sarah. But Michael had never been violent. He had never even been in a physical fight. He was a man who solved problems with logic and precision, a man who worked in the abstract world of software and code. The idea of actually murdering someone was incomprehensible to him. And so, his mind found a solution that allowed him to commit the murder while remaining, in his own perception, innocent. He would confess to a crime he hadn't committed. He would tell the police that he had killed his wife. He would provide them with details. He would help them close the case. And real Sarah would remain alive, and imaginary Sarah would finally be free, and Michael would be punished for a crime that existed only in his mind, and everyone would be where they belonged. For 6 months, Michael planned this confession. He researched criminal psychology. He studied police interrogation techniques. He wrote out detailed scripts of what he would say. He imagined every question Detective Maria Santos would ask him, and he prepared answers. He thought about the evidence he would provide, the details he would invent, the timeline he would construct. He became so immersed in the fiction of his confession that he started to believe it had actually happened. He would wake up in the morning and forget, for a moment, whether he had actually killed his wife or only killed the imaginary version of her in his mind. The boundary between the narratives he'd written and reality had become so thin that Michael could no longer see where one ended and the other began. Real Sarah, during this time, was trying to decide whether to leave him. She had consulted with a divorce attorney. She had looked at apartments. She had written a list of reasons why the marriage was over. She was gathering the courage to tell Michael that she wanted a separation. But before she could do that, on a Tuesday morning in October, Michael walked into the police station and confessed to murdering her. Detective Maria Santos was in her 19th year on the police force. She had seen false confessions before men who confessed to crimes they didn't commit because they felt guilty about something else, because they were mentally ill, because they wanted attention. She had developed an instinct for detecting them, but Michael's confession was different. He was too detailed, too organized, too coherent. He described a murder with precision. He explained his motives with clarity. He He walked through the steps he'd taken to dispose of evidence, to cover his tracks, to make the crime undetectable. The only problem was, none of it matched any known case. There was no missing woman named Sarah Chen. There was no body. There were no police reports. There was no investigation into a suspicious death. Detective Santos called the station's database. She made calls to hospitals and morgues. She searched for any report that matched Michael's description. And then, almost as an afterthought, she looked up Michael Chen's address and called it. Sarah answered the phone on the second ring. She was, in fact, alive. She was, in fact, at home. She was, in fact, completely unaware that her husband had just confessed to murdering her. What happened next was one of the strangest moments in Portland police history. Detective Santos asked to speak to Sarah in person. Sarah, confused and frightened, agreed. When Maria arrived at the apartment, Sarah opened the door looking exactly as Michael had described her in his confession. Tall, graceful, long dark hair. Real. Alive. Undeniably not dead. The detective sat Sarah down and explained, as gently as possible, that her husband had just confessed to murdering her. Sarah's reaction was not shock or disbelief. Her reaction was profound sadness mixed with a strange kind of vindication. She said quietly, "I think I know what happened." Over the next several hours, Detective Santos conducted separate interviews with both Michael and Sarah. Michael's story remained consistent. He had murdered his wife. He had planned it carefully. He had done it because he loved her and couldn't bear to see her unhappy. He had come to the police because he wanted to be punished for what he'd done. Real Sarah told a different story. She told Detective Santos about Michael's obsession. She told her about the way he'd isolated her, controlled her, demanded that she be a specific version of herself. She told her about the emotional suffocation, the surveillance, the subtle cruelty disguised as love. She told her about finding notebooks in Michael's desk filled with observations about her, narratives about her, stories in which she was trapped and he was her savior. And then Sarah said something that Detective Santos would later describe as the most chilling moment of her entire career. She said, "I think he's been killing me slowly this entire time. I think he's been killing the real me and replacing it with someone who matches his fantasy. And when I finally started to realize it, when I finally started to reclaim who I actually am, he couldn't handle it. So he invented a murder to make it real." Detective Santos ordered a full psychiatric evaluation of Michael Chen. She also, working with Sarah, began to piece together the true nature of Michael's crime. Michael had never committed physical violence against Sarah, but he had committed a form of violence that is, in many ways, more insidious. He had attempted to erase her personhood. He had tried to construct her into an ideal that could never exist. He had created a fiction in which she was a trapped, suffering victim, and he was her only path to freedom. And when real Sarah had the audacity to become herself again, to assert her own desires, to refuse to be the imaginary woman he'd invented, he had responded by creating an elaborate fantasy in which he murdered her. The district attorney's office ultimately decided not to file charges against Michael. Confessing to a crime that didn't happen is not itself a crime. Michael had not made false reports to police. He had, in a distorted way, told them the truth about his psychological state. He had not obstructed justice or wasted resources in a way that would justify criminal prosecution. What he had done was far more complicated than any law could address. Instead, Michael was ordered to undergo long-term psychiatric treatment. He was diagnosed with obsessive-compulsive personality disorder combined with delusional thinking. Psychologists who evaluated him found that Michael had constructed an entire alternate reality in which his wife existed as a fictional character within his own mind, and his confessed crime was an attempt to make that fiction real enough to matter. Real Sarah filed for divorce. She moved into an apartment with one of her childhood friends. She returned to the job she loved. She began the long process of reclaiming the parts of herself that Michael had convinced her to surrender. But the question that haunted everyone who read the case file was this: in confessing to murdering his wife, had Michael actually been telling the truth? Had he, in some sense, actually killed her? Had the woman who walked out of that apartment a few weeks after the confession actually been real Sarah? Or was she someone new? A woman born from the ashes of who Sarah used to be. A woman constructed from the pieces of herself that Michael had broken down. Psychologists who studied the case came to different conclusions. Some believed that Michael's confession was a manifestation of his fantasy, that he genuinely believed he had murdered Sarah because in his mind, he had. Others believed that Michael was, in a twisted way, confessing to the murder of Sarah's identity, the death of who she used to be before she met him. Michael spent 3 years in psychiatric care. He was eventually released with the requirement that he undergo ongoing therapy and remain on psychiatric medication for the rest of his life. He was also issued a restraining order preventing him from having any contact with Sarah. But before he was released, something happened that would add another layer to an already incomprehensible case. Michael recanted his confession. He told his psychiatric evaluation team that he had never actually murdered anyone. He said that he had confessed because he thought it would free his wife, because he thought that if he disappeared into the prison system, Sarah would finally be able to be herself. He said that he had constructed an entire fantasy in which his confession was an act of love, a final gift he was giving to the woman he had tried so hard to make perfect. When confronted with this recantation, Michael's psychiatrist, Dr. Elizabeth Warren, asked him a simple question. Do you believe that what you did to your wife, the emotional control, the surveillance, the attempts to reshape her into an imaginary ideal, was a form of violence? Michael's answer, after a long silence, was, I think I've been committing the same murder over and over for 7 years. I just did it in a way that didn't leave a body. Sarah Chen, when asked years later if she believed her husband had murdered her, gave an answer that has stayed with everyone who heard it. She said, he murdered who I was. He murdered who I thought I would become. He murdered the woman I was becoming before he met me. The Sarah that walked out of that apartment after his confession was a different person than the Sarah who went in. Whether that's a murder or a rebirth, I'm still not sure. But something that Sarah died in that marriage, and I don't think Michael's confession was about killing me. I think it was about finally acknowledging that the woman he loved had already been dead for years. She just hadn't stopped breathing yet. Michael Chen is now 51 years old. He lives alone in a different state. He works as a software developer for a company that didn't conduct a background check. He has been in therapy for over 15 years. He has not had a relationship since Sarah left him. He has written extensively in his journal about his obsession, his fantasy, the woman he invented, and the damage he caused to the real woman who tried to meet the specifications of an imaginary ghost. He has never been charged with a crime. He has never been convicted of anything. Legally, Michael Chen is a free man who committed no crime. But psychologically, morally, and spiritually, the question of whether Michael Chen murdered his wife has never been fully answered. He confessed to a crime that didn't happen. He showed evidence of a murder that never occurred. He described the death of a woman who continued living. And in doing so, he exposed one of the darkest truths about love and obsession, that sometimes the person we murder isn't our partner. It's the version of ourselves that we kill when we try to be someone else, and the version of our partner we destroy when we try to make them be someone they're not. What this case leaves behind is not a conviction or a body or even a clear crime. What it leaves behind is a question that might be harder to answer than any traditional murder investigation. Can you commit murder without killing someone? Can you murder someone's identity, their sense of self, their future, and still be innocent of any crime? Sarah Chen would probably say yes. Michael Chen spent years in psychiatric care trying to answer that very question. And everyone who reads this case comes away with a different conclusion about whether a man who confessed to a murder that never happened was telling the truth or a lie. The only certainty in this entire case is this. Michael Chen loved his wife so much that he tried to destroy her. And when she refused to die, when she insisted on remaining herself, his response was to confess to having killed her anyway. Because in his mind, the real Sarah, the one with her own agency, her own desires, her own contradictions, had never truly lived at all. She had always been a phantom. And he was finally being honest about it. If this story kept you watching until the very end, you understand why we call this channel Psych Files. Because the darkest crimes aren't always the ones where someone dies. Sometimes, they're the ones where someone survives, but no one is quite sure who they are anymore. Subscribe, because the next case we cover will make you question the difference between love and obsession in ways you never thought possible.